And we are live, Feeding the Dragon podcast. Ryan Ray alongside Mr. Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton, how are you doing today, sir?
I am very good. I'm just retweeting your tweet so that everybody knows that we are live. We're still on Periscope, it seems like,
Yeah,
huh? So,
Periscope still up and kicking. Like you can't log in, but you was there. And I got to give a special shout out. One of my best friends is having a baby today, so I doubt he's watching. But Kyle, if you have to catch the replay, hope everything goes well. They are waiting uh, in the process of in delivery, I guess, right now or soon to be delivered. So I hope all goes well with Mama and the new addition to the family. And congratulations. So that is I want to throw that out there. Kyle is a regular watcher, but he's a better friend of the program. So, anyways, Mr. Fenton, let's see here. Where do you want to start at, sir? I know you were talking offline. You've been making the media rounds. Let's talk about that a little bit and then get into the meat some.
yeah, there's just been a lot of activity, especially after the Oscars this weekend on the Chloe Zhao situation, the Do Not Split documentary, the fact that the Oscars weren't broadcast in China. Why weren't they broadcast in China? Why does Chloe have such an issue in China? What's going on with Disney and Marvel in that situation? And then on top of it, Beijing 2022, the Olympics, that continues to be a big subject that everybody's discussing whether to boycott or not, which once again, I go into that shouldn't be the question. It should be, what do we want to do and require of the CCP in order to show up for those Olympics? Because quite frankly, I hope we do show up, and I hope we show up with all of our athletes, but I hope we get some things done in the next 300 days that proactively move us towards a more rebalanced and reset relationship with China, including things like human rights issues, which we continue to talk about and need to get addressed. And then on top of it, we still haven't figured out where the COVID origins are, and their neighbor India, which is one of the big sort of allies in this idea of curtailing a bit of the spreading of the wings of the great dragon of China. They're mired in a COVID crisis right now. And who knows how bad it's going to get from here. So that's a little scary. And then there was one other topic that came up today in some of my news rounds, which is this political article with several in the military asking to disclose some previously confidential wires and various other information that discuss China and China's challenge. So a lot to talk about. So I'll let you lead the way and we can get into it.
Yeah, well, let's start off with the obvious. I am not a lobster. I don't know why I look so red today on camera, but I'm not. But if you want to listen to the podcast, if you miss any of this, you can download the show on, go to iTunes, Spotify, Feeding the Dragon, or you can continue to watch me in my red glory. I have no idea what's going on here, but I'm not this red in real life. You mentioned let's talk about the military thing and what's going on there, because there was a report, and it came out from the Epoch Times, which is kind of fringe. But I remember asking someone if they'd heard it from credible sources, and the answer was yes. But it never caught headlines. And the story was, I think we talked about on the show, that the UN was actually feeding the CCP names of known dissidents, right? This is kind of a narrative that we see, whether it's with the military or with large government institutions, is there's this back and forth with the CCP, either bribing or using the honey trap or whatever it is to kind of get information. And it doesn't really get the attention that maybe it should, it feels like.
Yeah, I don't know that particular article or story. And the Epoch Times, I've talked to Jan Kellenick about it because I've done America's Thought Leaders, which is a show that I think is a spinoff essentially of the Epoch Times family. And I just don't know exactly why they've gone so extreme with particular articles that seem to slant them in a hard right type of way, because I do think of some of their reporting and journalistic intentions are very deep and well done, but it just has pigeonholed them in this space where a lot of people don't believe what's in there. But one of the reasons you brought up this story was because of the Political article today, which was about disclosing some of these previously confidential secured secrets and how we see China's threat to the United States of America. And there's military members that are pushing for it, for those to be disclosed to the American public. And I like that idea a lot, because, as we talked about many times on this show, the China challenge facing America and facing our Western allies is a slow-moving train wreck. It is just really difficult to see happening in real time. It's very difficult for the average American, the average citizen from the West, to take time out of their day and pay attention to it and care about it and push their legislators and the policymakers and the businesses they go to as consumers to do the right thing on national security issues. So the only way to get them there and to actually touch and feel the importance of this challenge and the immediacy that it has to be dealt with. And we talked about Matt Pottinger saying, we literally have 4 years until China 2025 is hit. That is our moment to get this done and moving in the right direction. To get people feeling that immediacy, feeling that ticking clock, we're going to have to expose as much as we can that's going to give some sort of tangible touch and feel of what the problem is, and get the American public and everybody that reports to the American public and the Western public and the people that report to the Western citizens on the same page and realize we need to tackle and address this issue now, today, ASAP.
The one thing I love about talking about China is it actually is a great mirror for how we look at all kinds of other issues. And so if you look at how the U.S. government operates, it is not uncommon for them to classify Ryan Ray and Chris Fitton are having lunch today. And there's nothing important. It's just that we're having lunch. We put it classified and therefore it's classified. So we talk about revealing and being transparent. Our government has shifted so far into the cloak and dagger type mentality that when you want to reveal what's going on with China, don't be surprised that this will get tied into the war on terror or national security. And this is kind of, we talk about principles. How do you think about things? This is something we have to think about. We want transparency with China. Our government will push back and say, well, guess what? Over here, we can't do it because of this is tied up to some kind of Islamic threat in the Middle East. Like, well, okay, I don't know if that's true or not. I want to see the information, which is what you're saying. We want to see the information, and we have to be prepared that to push back on the government and say, no, we need to see this information. This is important. We need to see more of this, and not buy the standard line that it's national security or it's classified or whatever, because that is what allows a lot of the secrecy to happen, is this kind of overarching principle of national security that no one really even knows what it means. And and I'm serious, if you go look at the reports that what they classify, a lot of what's classified now is not even relevant to anything. It's just simply lunch meetings, calendar meetings, stuff like that.
Yeah. So, well, hopefully there's things that actually identify the issue, and it's something that can be held on to in the same way. I mean, let's face it, the Uyghur atrocities that are happening in the Xinjiang province are real touch and feel human rights issues that have that emotional element that ties humans together and makes us realize, whoa, this is something I do not stand for. This is something that isn't right. This is something that needs to be addressed immediately. With most of this stuff coming out of China, including climate change and various tech transfers that seem like they're very sort of blasé and don't really mean anything now, but mean something 10 years down the road, it's hard to see the reality of this challenge. So it's definitely something where, if you're looking at what is battling essentially the course of action that we take on the dynamic between the U.S. and China from the Washington, D.C. perspective, it is national security interests butting heads with business interests, right? At one point, national security interests were so muted, in fact, for probably most of the last 40 years, that business interests completely overrode anything that was remotely a problem. The part that is going to be an issue now is that in order to address China, I believe the human flight or fight, the national security, the economic security, the things that make people feel secure in the world are going to be the overriding sort of emotional core of addressing this problem from one of motivation, right? Because if it's from the business side of it, it's hard to counter the money that can be made in that market, right? So it has to be addressed from the national security side. And that's what we're seeing now in Washington, D.C., with bipartisan support of some of these Senate bills that are on the floor now, with some of the stuff that we're seeing from the Pentagon, and obviously some of the stuff that we're seeing from the administration itself.
Let me push back on the national security angle for a second. If you go read Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, he obviously worked in the government, and I'll be quite honest, my reading of what he said is that, he didn't say this language, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and pretty much worldwide. And so you have the Cold War going on, and the U.S. is trying to manipulate China to be our ally. And so we directed companies to sell to China. We steered people to China. We hope to influence China in the name of national security to beat the Russians. And so I hear what you're saying. That's why I don't like the national security mantra, because what happens is something like that. And then we go, oh, well, God, we didn't think about that. Or, oh my gosh, we did it. We messed up here. So I'm a little concerned that the national security is the mechanism that they will use, and then they will just screw it up worse than if just using their own terms. Pillsbury admits we screwed it up, so I'm just taking his words. They'll screw it up again, and under the guise of national security. So I think if you go read some of these people who worked in government, they would say that a lot's happened with China was because of national security, but we were fighting the Russians then, and now we're fighting the Chinese. And so what's going to be different this time?
Well, that's a great point. And it shows that you're much more well-read on that history than I am. And especially because I learned today from Captain Corey Ray of the National War College that when we boycotted the 1980 Olympics, 50 countries joined us. Most of them weren't our European allies either. But China joined us in that boycott. So they were, I guess, the enemy of an enemy and thusly a friend. So I would argue that not only was national security muted back then compared to business interests, but you could actually say that national security interests and business interests were completely aligned back then, right? So it actually amplified how much we engage between the U.S. and China. I think that's a great point. But now we look at it, and I don't see that enemy of an enemy as your friend scenario. I mean, yes, we have Middle East issues, and it would be nice to see China go and fill that vacuum and get mired in some crazy war for 20 years or something like that. But I don't really see them as an enemy of our enemy in the way that the Russia-China situation was, although you might know history better than me and can relate it there.
Well, no, I mean, it's not a point I wanted to belabor, but I just think that I think my overarching principle is under the guise of national security, we have screwed up a lot of foreign policy. And so I want transparency. And when I say I want transparency, I want transparency. I don't, and the argument the pushback will be as well, this is for national security. And I would just present exhibit A, B, C, D, E of all the things that the government has screwed up under the guise of national security. And I would like to point out that they're probably incompetent to determine what is the best foreign policy. They're the elected officials, they have the power. I'm not denying that. I got a pretty good track record to point to say that they're probably not the ones who should be keeping the cloak over everything and hiding it from us, because they're going to screw it up. But other things to get to. Let's talk about the Oscars this weekend. I think you called Nomadland to win it. I heard that film was the betting favorite. The betting was pretty big favorite going into the weekend. It took home Best Director. Was that the right one? What was your takeaway from the Oscars and how it tied to China? Did I get all that right? Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of a terrible member of the Hollywood community because I actually was at a club lacrosse game for my son during most of it. So obviously I was keeping tabs on it. I was very curious to see if Do Not Split won for short, and it unfortunately didn't, because I think the filmmakers behind Do Not Split would have definitely made some sort of political statement that involved China, most likely with the Hong Kong situation, although I would argue they probably would have brought in the Uyghur Xinjiang province controversy also. And then Chloe Zhao won for Nomadland, and Nomadland won Best Picture, etc. I still, and I've been asked a bunch today about my thoughts as to why the CCP was so against covering Chloe and her wins at this year's Oscars. I mean, it's a tremendous accomplishment for a woman who was born and raised in China to actually come overseas to the West, learn a trade, hone that craft to the point where she gets to the mecca of achievement in it and win, not only as a Chinese director, but as a Chinese woman director. When you look at only one other woman, no matter what nationality we're talking about, has won Best Director before. It's an unbelievable accomplishment. And the CCP literally wanted to muzzle it from being discussed in China. And it's just a really interesting nuance that I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, and no one knows for sure. And I definitely don't know for sure. But as I've said before, I do think a lot of it goes back to sort of a Yao Ming principle, which is go off, study overseas, hone your craft overseas, train overseas, become the best in the world overseas, compete at the highest level overseas, get your glory, get your success, get your riches, and then come back to the homeland, right? And Yao Ming did that. Chloe Zhao still lives in the United States of America. And I think that is the cold that is bothering the CCP, not the symptoms of, oh, should she apologize for some of the quotes she had in 2013 or whatever it is. I think it's the fact that it's hard for the CCP to explain to people they're trying to build nationalistic pride about, living in the greatest country in the world underneath the most amazing, government in the world. Suddenly this woman who can live anywhere in the world and has gotten all the acclaim and attention of the world on her decides to live somewhere other than China.
And what was did she say anything controversial in her speech?
No, she did sort of the opposite. It seemed as if she was trying to thread the needle of both sides. She definitely didn't come out and kowtow or pander to the Chinese, Communist Party and apologize or whatever it was. She seemed to be sort of graciously neutral, although at the end of her speech, she did use an old Chinese proverb that she said in Mandarin, which roughly translated means everyone is born a nice, beautiful person. And then, life changes things or something like that. And then there was a Global Times op-ed that came out shortly thereafter that seemed to offer a little bit of an opening of hope that this would find resolution at some point. But then on the other side, it seemed a little insulting too. It told her she needed to mature and understand the responsibility and whatever it was. So I don't know. There's just a lot of conflicting messages, and it's really interesting to see how this plays out. And one of the biggest movies of the year was directed by her, and that's coming out this fall, called The Eternals, which is a Marvel Disney movie.
Okay. One more movie question for you. Mortal Kombat did a 22.5 million opening with 6.3 million worldwide. That sounds kind of low, but people were praising that. Am I missing something there?
I think well, first of all, the expectations were lower than the final results. So that's always fun to report on, which is like, oh, we beat expectations, right? But the expectations were very low. There was also a Japanese anime film that came out too that did, I guess, relatively well given COVID issues. The numbers are still sort of terrible in any sort of historic measure, but compared to COVID comps, the argument is that theaters are coming back in the United States of America. Everybody wants to go see a movie in a movie theater. And that's sort of the narrative that's being played out of my ecosystem, Hollywood.
As long as HBO Max is streaming new movies, I will be watching them right here because it's so. I took my daughter to see Tom and Jerry. Well, I got 3 daughters. My oldest daughter see Tom and Jerry. Whenever that came out about a month ago, and that's the first time I've been to the theater since COVID. But I've got 4 kids, and so if they're coming out here, I can go watch them on my computer. Makes life so much easier for someone like me. Okay, so
do we know? By the way, I was just looking it up. HBO Max. When is that movie coming out?
Yeah, I was trying to look it up while we were talking earlier. It's supposed to come out this month, wasn't it? What's it called again? Can't Breathe.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, I thought it was supposed to come out in March was what I thought. But I haven't seen it, and I'm searching for it. Yeah, exactly. In the same breath. Yeah, I'm curious to see what happens there because once again, we talked about the fact that that might have been the decision of an HBO Max executive pulling the trigger on that film without checking up all the way up the food chain at Warner Media or AT&T, and then suddenly somebody says, "Whoa, that's gonna piss off the Chinese government. What are we doing?" And I'm
Right.
curious to see if that announcement that happened in January slowly like just dissipates into the ether.
Yeah, I'm logging into HBO Max right now, which also they've got a pretty good stable of movies for the newer platform. But anyways, and I'll see if I can get something on that there. Okay, Mr. Fenton, one of the things I want to you brought up the Olympics briefly. Did you have any more comments on that we need to circle back around to golf?
No, I was on a show earlier with Captain Corey Ray of the National War College, and we were just talking about all the different complexities with requiring certain things in order to show up for the Olympics. And my argument is like if we ever have a point of leverage, it's now, And then he was asking, well, what are the things we should aim for? And I said, well, quite frankly, we still got to figure out where COVID came from, so we should have access there. We should figure out the Xinjiang Uyghur issues, so we should have some sort of access there. We should stop China from provoking Taiwan and invading its military airspace and maritime, waters, and stop with these drills and this thumping of the chest. Like lots of things that we should try to get accomplished in the next 300 days. And then there's smaller check the box things too. And I think overall the belief is like, look, there is a great point of leverage. There's less than 300 days left, and we need to take advantage of it. And what we need to really do is talk about all the different things we can put on the table and what we can actually achieve in that time and actually make it a real firm red line that we will not be there unless you abide by these. And then the question is who would join us? And my theory is that we would definitely get Australia, Canada, and the UK to join because of all the issues that they're having presently with China. And then, I actually think India might join us in that too. And then it's a question of will any of the regional allies or some of the European allies join forces on that also?
Well, if we go back to about a year ago, I don't have the exact dates, but somewhere around a year ago, for the next 6 months, is really when China ramped stuff up. Hong Kong, India skirmishes, like all that stuff really started. Australia, all that stuff really started because this is the end of April. So the U.S. had been shut down for about a month, roughly about now, something like that. So this is when we started to see China really escalate last year, and I just don't think that they've continued that escalation. They're still doing stuff, but from my perspective, they really kind of slowed down from where they were last year. They are still pushing the agenda with Taiwan, and there's certainly things you can point to, but it feels like they have scaled back on some level. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment?
I would disagree on Taiwan. I would disagree on the South China Sea and the Philippines. I would disagree on definitely fishing grounds. I disagree on Antarctica and the Arctic regions. I would disagree on the India side of things, although I did see they reached out to say we'd help bring in more vaccines to, deal with the crisis that's going on there. Australia is not having a good time with China right now. In fact, there was another thing that I think Bill Bishop sent out today. I hadn't read the article yet, but something about the Chinese telling them, you need to stay in your place. You guys are idiots or whatever, or something like that. You still got the two Michaels being held hostage and all the Canadian issues that are ongoing. It's, if anything, it's status quo from an elevated tense state, but I would argue it's gotten worse. And by the way, the UK interaction with China has gotten worse with the Hong Kong issue and the visas and all the other stuff with the national security law. So it's not, and by the way, Germany is backing out of that, that deal they made 4 months ago that was supposed to be the new investment coexistence deal between Europe and the EU and China.
Yeah. Okay. So I would agree that they have maintained from where they escalated to, and there are definitely some pushing that they're pushing the buttons. I think last year they really kind of took a lot of steps forward. It felt like, and so they're not keeping that same clip. So they're maintaining maybe slight pushing. I would agree with that assessment. And of course, some areas more than others, but they're not there's no people dying on the border with India this year that I'm aware of. Like right now, I think that so like some of that's kind of calmed down.
No, although there was something very strange, and I didn't post it on Twitter because I was sort of confused exactly what went on. But there was was it a Chinese ambassador to Pakistan was at a hotel, and there was the hotel bombing in Pakistan that killed a lot of people. Did you see that article? I don't know what exactly.
Yeah.
And then obviously China's been spreading its wings in the Middle East a bit too in the last month. So, and then on the business front, it's been way beyond any sort of, it's gotten closer to the day of reckoning than ever. If you look at everything from Hugo Boss to Burberry to Nike, Adidas, even the NBA continues to be in the crosshairs. Although I saw an article that they're going to be involved with an expo that's coming up, and they're trying to continue to repair damage that has been ongoing for almost a year and a half. So I don't know. If anything, it's status quo at an elevated stage. I'll go with that.
All right. Okay. So let's pivot now to something that I think that when you talk about the fear that the Americans feel or they're concerned about China, you have to balance it out with this. And this is from the South China Morning Post. China reportedly set to announce its first decline in population since 1949. From the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, agreeing China may have to put off retirement. Workers aren't happy. So we talk about communism. This is the thing that I think that Americans have to really, really, really realize and can't forget. A, there's a ton of propaganda that comes out of China, but B, they are going to have major misses. And so if you go back and look at the one-child policy, which came late 70s, if I remember correctly, that was off of, I think, the two-China policy or a two-child policy, basically, or two children pretty much. And you go back, they have starvation before that. So China's population and their growth is as a result of some of their top-down policies and just complete whiffs at the government level has resulted in the population having to work longer than they expected, A, and B, their population, they're going to have to figure out how to do something, right? So either means bring in people to the country, which they don't like doing, or let people leave the country and go marry and then come back or something like that. But that's not really what they want to do. And so they're going to find themselves in a problematic situation with their workforce because their workforce will get older, will age out, and they will die. And so I think this is kind of a story that's a good reminder that for all the fear that people feel about China is, as long as they're communist and they're really top down putting pressure on their economy, they're going to have massive whiffs along with their big successes. That's how I read this. How do you take it?
Well, I get a little infuriated by these stories because if you and you're obviously been in the energy business for a long time, but if you think of what's in the best interest of the world and the sustainability for the world, lowering the population would be the best. And quite frankly, it would be the best for each nation too, because the taxing on resources and infrastructure gets diminished with a population that gets smaller and smaller. But instead, what we've done with our capitalistic system, which by the way, I'm a big believer in free market capitalism, but we've really debt fueled it with all kinds of central bank balance sheet shenanigans that have caused this reliance on debt that is so overwhelming that the only way out of it is to continue growing these populations and growing these economies based on the growth of those populations. And it drives me crazy because it's not what's in the best interest of the world overall. Japan has been battling this, obviously. China, we've been talking about for a long time, will hit that barrier, and apparently the US only grew 6% over the last decade, which seems to me to be plenty, but according to most economists, that's not going to be enough for us to grow our way out of all the debt that we put on ourselves. So I don't know, I'm torn on this one, and I do like when I hear populations are getting smaller because we have a very small finite earth that we all got to live on.
Okay, so I disagree wholeheartedly with that assessment. And here's why. First off, we are the richest point of human history with the most humans ever. So to say that we have more humans is worse would go counter to the narrative that we have more humans and more wealth. And that's like it. Second is the amount of earth we actually live on is what, less than 10%, maybe 5%. I don't know. It can't be much. If you go look at Google Earth and the lights at night, most of the earth is actually uninhabited. So we have tons of room to live. Third is the problems that you're pointing to have little to do with capitalism or anything. They're tied to government policy. Here comes a libertarian spiel. You can see that coming, but they're tied to government policies. So they're not capitalistic problems. They are problems that are tied to government planning. So the government tries to plan stuff and they can't adjust, and so then you have these huge problems. I was actually talking about this book offline. What to Expect When No One's Expecting is a great book that examines this. And Europe actually realizes that their economy, their countries are in trouble because they're not birthing kids at the replacement level, and therefore they will have huge problems. And so they've built parks, all this kind of stuff to encourage people to have children. So will they be successful? Seems unlikely, but maybe they will. Finally, I'll just say that the initiative of less humans. Well, so go back to the Avengers. I always like using this analogy. So when Thanos made the snap, right, and he killed half of the people. Well, if you stop and think about that, well, we don't really know what that would look like, but they would probably screw up the world in ways that we can't possibly fathom. Because did he kill only half of the plumbers? And it kind of sounds silly, but it's a good point. Did he kill half the plumbers? Right? Because if he didn't kill half the plumbers, he killed all of the plumbers. Then all of a sudden you have a huge issue in society where you can't actually get the plumbing done. That's a theoretical movie, but the point is that when you start talking about population increase or decrease, wealth builds more jobs, and wealth encourages people to have families, or it should at least, to have families and to grow that. And so energy problems, all this stuff, most of this is constructs that's not really based in reality. And a lot of these issues are really government issues. So I think more humans is great. I am pro-human, pro more humans, and we live on very, 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 very small portion of the earth.
Yeah, but first of all, I'm going to call you a jerk for disagreeing with me. Damn you. Okay. No, but I mean, look, you bring up interesting points. And by the way, I'm a capitalist. I like capitalism. I don't think what central banks have been doing to essentially put way more debt than growth on all these nations is really capitalism. I feel like that's a centrally planned capitalism of some sort. So I think we have to grow our way out of stuff. And unfortunately, that involves a lot more humans in order to consume stuff that we have diminished resources of. By the way, people don't live everywhere on the earth because there's a thing called water that we all need, fresh water. And there's not a lot of fresh water out there. Right.
Okay, so go look at, but just go, when we get off, on all seriousness, just go Google the lights at night at Earth. And
I know. But look at where those lights are. They're where there's water, like where there's fresh water. Where there's no fresh water, the Sahara does not have many people because there's literally no fresh water there.
I'm not going to argue that there's no fresh water there. I'm just saying that. Okay, but so the point would be the same, is that there's more people today living in more, like I would not live in Texas in 1865. It's too hot. It is too hot, right? But you can live in, we can have 6 million people in Houston and 5 million in Dallas or whatever because we have air conditioning. This amount of people would not live in Texas normally because it's just too hot. We live.
Yeah, I literally saw, we were in Arizona for some sports tournament in some town, and somebody was rattling off how the town started, and literally all those towns around Phoenix, they all sprung up like literally a few years after air conditioning was invented. Like that's it.
Like, so we live in places now that we wouldn't naturally live in because it's inhabitable. And so the difference between cold and heat is that you can warm up eventually if you put enough clothes on. Well, it's hot. It's just hot. It's just hot. And so you can live in colder climates. Anyways, okay. 33-minute mark. We're up against the clock here. Anything else before we get out?
No, I think that's it. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I'm loving the fact that, what seemed to be just one side of the aisle talking about China now is both sides of the aisle. It's fantastic because it's an American issue, red and blue. It's the same thing with the fact that we're moving multilateral on a lot of our approaches with China. I think that's super smart. I think a lot of people are now gravitating towards this idea that we don't want a war. We definitely don't want a hot war, and we don't really want a cold war in the traditional sense. But there's this idea that between cyber and information and obviously trade and whatever, there are elements of Cold War out there. But slowly, the idea that we need to address this and are starting to talk about it and addressing it is happening. And I give it all to this podcast. No, just kidding. And by the way, this podcast will get back on track once I get offline and tell Ryan he cannot disagree with me like that. But anyway, we have a good yin and yang on here, and I'm glad some people are listening to us, but more importantly, a lot of people are listening to a lot of people that are starting to talk about this more and more. So thank you for tuning into this, and thank you for bringing the discussion and adding great comments and all that kind of stuff and supporting the podcast. Super appreciate it.
As you mentioned, this show for those on the podcast is live, which you can find at Ryan Ray Sr. or at the Dragon Feeder on Twitter. We release when we're about to go live. If you're watching the live broadcast, it is a podcast. And so you can go to the Dragon Feeder on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast to download it. And next time, I will do my best to not disagree with Mr. Finch, because that's what the CCP wants. And we know that, like, there you are. I want to support what the CCP wants, which is everyone agrees at all times. And so in honor of you and the CCP, I will agree with you next time.
We have one party narrative on this podcast.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back hopefully this week, if not next week for sure.